Mark Jensen had long made peace with silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over a man after a full and satisfying day, but the hollow, persistent silence of a life that had learned to shrink itself into something manageable. He was 42 years old, living alone in a weathered two-story house on the outskirts of Millfield, Oregon. A town small enough that most people knew your car before they knew your name. He worked as a property assessor for the county, a job that required him to measure and document the value of other people's homes while returning each evening to a place that felt, in all the ways that mattered, like it had no value at all. He had not always been this way. There were photographs, tucked inside the second drawer of his bedroom dresser beneath a folded wool sweater, that told a different story. A younger Mark at a university graduation, laughing with his mouth wide open, one arm thrown around a classmate whose name he could no longer remember. Mark in his mid-20s at the edge of the Pacific, shirt off, squinting into a brilliant sunset with the kind of careless confidence that belongs exclusively to men who have not yet been truly hurt. A younger version of his mother, Linda Jensen, slender, dark-eyed, her smile tight with something that looked like pride but could also have been sadness if you knew how to read it. Those photographs never made it to the walls or the mantel. They stayed in the drawer, face down more often than not, because looking at them required a kind of emotional energy Mark had quietly stopped budgeting for. His mother had died 7 years earlier from a slow illness that gave them both just enough time to say the things they needed to say, and still somehow not enough. She had been everything to him growing up, his only anchor in a home that had been, for as long as he could remember, defined by a single devastating absence. His father, Robert Jensen, had left when Mark was 9 years old. That was the story. That was the fact around which the entire architecture of Mark's inner life had been constructed. His mother never spoke about Robert with venom, which Mark had always found more unsettling than anger would have been. She simply said, with a quiet finality that discouraged further questions, that his father had chosen a different life. Chosen. That word had lodged itself somewhere deep in Mark's chest and stayed there for 33 years. He had grown into a careful man as a result, careful with attachments, careful with expectations, careful never to depend on anything he could not control. He had come close to marriage once, in his early 30s, with a woman named Claire who had eventually told him, gently but clearly, that loving him felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. He did not disagree. He had watched her go without a fight, not because he did not care, but because some part of him believed that people who mattered always left eventually. And it was better to accept that truth early than to spend years pretending otherwise. His evenings followed a ritual so consistent it had become almost meditative. He would come home from work, change out of his county-issued shirt, heat something simple on the stove, soup from a can, pasta with jarred sauce, eggs scrambled with whatever vegetables had not yet gone soft in the refrigerator, and eat at the kitchen table with the window open if the weather permitted. He would read for an hour or so, mostly history and the occasional crime novel, then watch the local news with the volume low, and be in bed by 10. He told himself this was discipline. On harder nights, when the house felt particularly large and the silence pressed in from all directions, he admitted it was something else. But morning always came, and with it the reliable structure of work, and that was enough. It had to be enough. On the last ordinary night of his ordinary life, Mark sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of a bowl of lentil soup pushed to one side and an old photograph in his hand. It was the last one taken of his mother before her diagnosis. She was standing in her small garden in Portland, holding a trowel, wearing a sun hat she had bought at a yard sale and loved unreasonably. Her eyes were on the camera, and there was something in them he had spent years trying to name. Resignation, maybe, or perhaps the particular stillness of a woman who had carried a secret long enough that it had become part of her posture. He set the photograph down on the table and looked out the dark window at the rain, beginning to fall in long silver streaks across the glass. And he thought, not for the first time, that some questions were simply never going to be answered. Some absences were simply permanent. Some closed doors had no handles on the inside. He said it quietly to the empty kitchen, the way a person sometimes does when a thought becomes too heavy to keep entirely inside the mind. Some answers are just never going to come. Then he rinsed his bowl, turned off the kitchen light, and listened to the rain get heavier against the roof, filling the house with a sound that was almost, but never quite, company. The knock came at 11:47 in the evening. Mark knew the time because he had glanced at the clock on the nightstand exactly 4 minutes earlier, debating whether to put down the book he was reading and admit that sleep was not coming. The sound was deliberate, 3 measured knocks, not frantic, not the kind that signals emergency, but insistent enough to cut cleanly through the rain and the old house's ambient creaking. He lay still for a moment, certain he had imagined it. Then it came again, 3 knocks, the same careful rhythm. He pulled on a sweatshirt and jeans and came down the stairs with the particular wariness of a man who lived alone and had learned not to be careless. Through the frosted glass panel beside the front door, he could see the shape of a person not large, not moving frantically, just standing in the rain with what appeared to be a bag or some kind of case held against their chest. He turned on the porch light and opened the door. The woman standing on his front step was somewhere in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back practically, and a dark wool coat darkened further by the rain. She was not from Millfield. He would have recognized her. She had the kind of face that belonged to someone who had spent a great deal of her life listening rather than speaking. Attentive, composed, with deep-set eyes that were taking in his face, with an expression he could not immediately categorize. Under one arm she held a rectangular wooden box, lacquered and old, about the size of a shoebox, but slightly wider. In her free hand, she carried an envelope, ivory-colored, thick. "Are you Mark Jensen?" she asked. Her voice was steady, neither apologetic nor aggressive. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and had finally decided to simply do it. Mark said yes. She exhaled, and something in her posture shifted, not relief exactly, but the particular release of a person who has been holding something in place for a very long time. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said. "I don't expect you to know who I am, but I knew your father. I worked with him for nearly a decade, a long time ago, and I've been carrying these." She shifted the box slightly, indicating both it and the envelope, for 20 years, trying to decide when and whether to bring them to you. She paused. "I decided tonight. I'm sorry it took so long. May I come in?" Mark stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was polite. The rain was filling the silence between them with its steady, indifferent sound, and the porch light was catching the gray in Evelyn's hair and the wear in her coat, and something about the combination of those details, her patience, the box, the sealed envelope, the word father delivered without drama or manipulation, made him step back and open the door wider. She came in and stood in his entryway, dripping quietly onto the mat, while he went to get a towel, and then thought better of it, and asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. They sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where, less than an hour ago, he had told the empty room that some answers never come. The box sat between them. The envelope lay on top of it. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and looked at him with that careful, listening face, and after a moment she said, "I should have come sooner. I've told myself that so many times it stopped meaning anything. But I want you to know that bringing this to you tonight is the right thing. It should have been the right thing a long time ago." She slid the envelope across the table toward him. "That was written by your father. The seal is still intact. It was meant for you. He gave it to me himself, years ago, and asked me to see that you received it if something happened to him, or if he ever lost the chance to give it to you himself." She looked at the envelope. "He said he was afraid your mother might intercept it if he sent it directly." Mark looked at the envelope. His father's handwriting, a script he had never seen in his life, and yet recognized immediately as something that should have been familiar, spelled out his name across the front. "Mark Jensen, nothing else." 20 years, he said. 22, Evelyn answered. "I'm sorry." Mark picked up the envelope and held it for a long moment, without opening it. Then he broke the seal. The letter was 4 pages long, written in blue ink on plain paper, in a hand that was measured at first and grew more urgent as the pages turned. Mark read it the way a person reads something they have waited for their entire life without knowing it, slowly, then all at once, then slowly again, going back to sentences that refused to settle. His father began by writing that he understood if Mark never believed a word of what followed. He wrote that he had composed this letter more than a dozen times over the years and destroyed every version, not because the words were wrong, but because he was afraid the distance between them had grown too great for any letter to cross. He wrote that he had not left. He needed Mark to understand that before anything else. He had not chosen to leave his wife and his son. He had been pushed out not by any single dramatic confrontation, but by a sustained, coordinated effort by Linda's family to end the marriage and ensure he had no path back into their lives. Mark set the letter down. His jaw was tight. He was aware of Evelyn watching him with that same composed, careful attention, and he was grateful she did not speak. He picked the letter up again. Robert Jensen wrote about a financial dispute that had erupted when Mark was 8 years old, a business arrangement with Linda's brother that had collapsed badly and left Robert accused of misappropriating funds that had, in fact, been mishandled by the brother himself. He wrote that he had been given a choice, delivered through a lawyer: leave the state quietly, relinquish any claim to contact with his family, and the accusations would disappear, or fight and watch his reputation destroyed in a town where Linda's family had lived for 3 generations, and he had been an outsider for 12 years. He had made the wrong choice. He knew that. He had told himself he would fight from the outside, that he would find another way back, that the separation would be temporary. It was not temporary. He wrote that he had tried, many times, to reach Mark and his mother. He described letters sent that received no reply, phone calls that were answered by Linda's mother and then disconnected, a visit to the school where Mark was enrolled, turned away by an administrator who had clearly been instructed to refuse him. He wrote these things without self-pity, which made them harder to read than if they had been soaked in it. He wrote that he understood how it must have looked. He wrote that he had loved Linda despite everything, and that whatever had been broken between them in those last terrible months, he had never stopped believing she was a good woman and a good mother. He wrote that there was not a single milestone of Mark's life he had not known about and thought about on the day it happened, from a distance, alone. The letter ended with a sentence that Mark read 4 times in a row. I don't ask you to forgive me for the choice I made when you were 8 years old. I only ask you to know that every day since then, I have wished I had made a different one. Mark put the letter down on the table. He did not speak for a while. Then he said, flatly and without heat, my mother would not have done this. Evelyn looked at him. I know that's hard to hear. She was not a person who would keep something like this from me. No, Evelyn said carefully. She wasn't. Not entirely. That's part of what makes this so complicated. She reached across the table and touched the edge of the wooden box. There's more in here. I think once you've seen the rest of it, things will make more sense. Or at least they'll be more honest, which isn't always the same as making sense. Mark looked at the box. The letter was still in his hands. The rain was still falling, and the kitchen was very quiet. And somewhere in the second drawer of his bedroom dresser, a photograph of his mother stood face down beneath a wool sweater. And he understood, with a certainty that frightened him, that the story he had built his entire adult life upon was about to come apart. Evelyn had worked as Robert Jensen's personal secretary for nearly 9 years, during the period when he had relocated to a small city in Northern California and rebuilt his career from scratch in property management. She had been 28 when she started working for him, recently divorced herself, and she had recognized in her employer a quality she could only describe as contained grief, the look of a man who had organized his pain into something functional and was living inside it as efficiently as possible. She had never asked questions. He had never offered explanations. But over the years, in small increments, the shape of his history had become clear. She told Mark about the financial accusations with the precision of someone who had read the relevant documents many times. Linda's brother, a man named Gary, had convinced Robert to invest in a commercial property venture in the mid-1980s. When the deal collapsed through Gary's own poor management and what Evelyn described as deliberate falsification of accounting records, the family had turned on Robert with coordinated speed. Gary had a lawyer who was also a close friend of Linda's father. The accusation was framed carefully. Robert, as the outside party with no local roots and no family money had been the obvious target. What made Evelyn's chest tighten, she told Mark, and what had kept her awake on and off for 2 decades, was the letters. Robert had written to Linda and to Mark consistently for years after leaving. He had written through a P.O. box. He had written through lawyers. He had eventually written to a neighbor of Linda's whose address he obtained through a former mutual friend, asking the neighbor to pass the letters along. Some had been returned unopened. The ones that weren't Evelyn paused here, her hands flat on the table. Linda's mother had apparently intercepted. Not Linda herself, or at least not initially. Her mother had run that household with an efficiency that extended, it turned out, to controlling the mail. Mark's hands were very still in his lap. He was listening with the focused, careful attention of a man trying to construct something accurate from materials that kept shifting shape. "How do you know any of this is true?" he asked. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question. "Because," Evelyn said, "your father kept records of everything. Every letter he sent, with dates, every returned envelope, every record of every attempt. It's all in the box." She slid it toward him gently. "And because 2 years before your mother died, she called your father." The kitchen went very quiet. "She called him," Evelyn repeated. After more than 20 years of silence, she had found out from Gary, of all people, in a moment of guilt late in his own life, what had actually happened with the letters and with the accusations. And she called Robert. She looked at her hands. "He told me about it the same day. He said she wept for most of the call. He said she told him she had believed what her family told her, that she had not known about the interception, that she was sorry." Evelyn looked up. "He said it was the best and worst phone call of his life." Mark opened the wooden box. Inside, bundled with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age, were dozens of envelopes. Some were sealed and never opened. Some had been opened and refolded. Some bore postmarks spanning 30 years. All of them were addressed, in the same blue ink handwriting he now recognized, to either Linda Jensen or Mark Jensen, at 2 different addresses in Portland, Oregon. He sat there for a long time, staring at them. He began reading the letters that night, and did not stop until the gray of early dawn had replaced the darkness in the kitchen window. Evelyn had fallen asleep in the armchair in his living room somewhere around 3 in the morning. Wrapped in a blanket he had wordlessly brought her, and he had read alone at the kitchen table with the wooden box open beside him and the stacked envelopes gradually moving from one side of the table to the other as he worked his way through them. The earliest letters were from when Mark was 9 years old, written within weeks of Robert's departure. They were the letters of a man in acute distress, trying very hard to sound calm, trying to write in a register that a young boy could understand without frightening him. Robert wrote about the weather where he was living. He asked if Mark was keeping up with Little League. He said he missed hearing Mark's voice and that he thought about their Saturday mornings together, eating cereal and watching cartoons, more than he could say. He said he hoped Mark would write back. He always said he hoped Mark would write back. Mark had never written back, because Mark had never received a single one of these letters. The letters across the following decade tracked Robert's life in spare, careful detail. A new job. A small apartment. A city that was never quite home. He wrote about watching news coverage of things happening in Oregon, his mind always drifting to whether Mark was nearby. He wrote a letter on the day he calculated that Mark would be turning 16, imagining what he might look like, hoping he had grown into something that resembled happiness. He wrote a long letter when Mark would have been graduating high school, noting the date carefully, saying he had driven once to the edge of Portland that spring not to approach anyone, just to be in the same geography for a few hours, as if proximity were its own kind of contact. He had turned around and driven back to California without getting out of the car. By the time Mark reached the letters from his late 20s and early 30s, he was no longer reading with his jaw clenched. Something had loosened in him without his permission. His father knew about his degree. He knew the name of the county where Mark worked. He knew that Mark had moved from Portland to Millfield, a fact delivered in a letter with a tone of cautious relief. The way a person feels when someone they love has settled somewhere quieter. He knew about Claire, described simply as the woman I heard you were seeing in Crestwood, though how Robert had heard this, and from whom, was never made clear, and the mystery of it made the detail feel more real, not less. In one letter, written when Mark was 35, Robert allowed himself a sentence that was completely unguarded. I know I am not a father to you in any way that counts, but I want you to know that I have been a father to you in the only way left available to me, which is that I have never stopped caring what happened to you or who you became. Mark sat back in his chair and pressed his palms hard against his eyes. He stayed like that for a long time. The house was very quiet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the pre-dawn birds were beginning their first uncertain notes in the dark trees at the edge of his yard. His chest felt like something that had been compressed for years had been slowly, painfully expanding. And he was not at all sure whether what he was feeling was grief or relief or something that had no clean name. He knew one thing with absolute clarity. He had been living inside the wrong story. It took Mark 3 weeks to decide to look for his father. The decision itself was not sudden. It accumulated the way most real decisions do, through sleepless nights and long drives and conversations with Evelyn that continued over the phone after she returned home to Sacramento. She gave him what she had, a last known address from roughly 4 years ago in a coastal town in Northern California called Harrow Point, the names of 2 men who had been Robert's colleagues in the mid-2000s, and a phone number that had been disconnected. He drove down on a Tuesday in late October, when the Oregon hills were burning gold, and the coast was cold and gray, and the kind of beautiful that requires some sadness in the viewer to be properly appreciated. He had the wooden box in the back seat. He did not know why he had brought it. It seemed wrong to leave it behind. The address Evelyn had given him corresponded to a small rental house on a narrow street 2 blocks from the water. A woman in her 40s answered the door and told him, not unkindly, that a Robert Jensen had rented the house until about 18 months ago, and then left without forwarding an address. She remembered him as quiet, polite, and fond of long walks on the beach in the early morning. She said he had no visitors that she could recall. She said the only thing he had ever talked about much was a son somewhere up north. Mark stood on the woman's porch and felt the particular sensation of being very close to something that keeps moving away. He thanked her. He was already turning to go when she called him back and handed him a small hardcover notebook, dark green, with his name written on a piece of tape on the front cover. She said Robert had left it with her when he moved, asking her to give it to a man named Mark Jensen if he ever came looking. She said she had never been entirely sure anyone would come, but she had kept it just the same. Inside the notebook, on the first page, in that now familiar blue ink, his father had written, "If you are reading this, then perhaps you are finally looking. I had started to believe you never would. I want you to know that I understand why it took this long, and I don't hold a single day of it against you." The rest of the notebook was not a journal. It was a collection of small preserved things, a ticket stub from an Oregon State football game dated the year of Mark's presumed graduation from high school, a newspaper clipping about a county property assessment program in Millfield that Robert had underlined and dated, a photograph of a stretch of beach, with a handwritten note on the back, reading, "This is where I have been coming to think about you." And tucked into the back cover, another envelope. This letter told Mark where his father was. Harrow Cove was a 40-minute drive south of Harrow Point, a smaller settlement at the end of a road that curved down through cypress trees to a narrow harbor. Robert Jensen was living in a converted fishing cottage on the water's edge, gray-shingled and low-roofed, with a small boat he apparently never used moored at the dock behind it. Mark parked on the gravel path and sat in the car for several minutes, watching the winter light move on the water before he got out. He knocked on the door. The man who opened it was 71 years old and looked, to Mark's eyes, like a photograph of someone familiar that had been left out in the weather for 30 years. He was lean and white-haired, with deep lines around his eyes, and a posture that still retained some structural remnant of what had once been confidence. He was wearing a gray wool sweater, and his hands, when he gripped the doorframe, were the hands of someone who had spent years doing physical work. He looked at Mark the way Mark imagined he himself must have looked at photographs in the second dresser drawer, with recognition and pain, and something beyond either of them. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. The sound of the harbor filled the silence between them, water against the dock pilings, the cry of a bird somewhere above the cypresses, the low moan of wind coming in off the coast. Mark became aware that his hands were shaking. He was 42 years old, and he was standing in front of his father for the first time in 33 years, and he had no idea what the first word was supposed to be. His father spoke first. "Are you doing all right?" he asked. His voice was quiet and careful, and it held, beneath its steadiness, the accumulated weight of every letter never received, and every year that had passed, and every morning he had woken up in whatever room he was occupying, and thought about a boy growing up without him. Mark opened his mouth. Something in his throat refused to cooperate. He pressed his lips together, and looked at the sky over his father's shoulder, and breathed through his nose for a moment. Then he said, "Not really. Not right now." He paused. "But I think I might be." Robert Jensen nodded slowly, like a man receiving news he had hoped for over many years and had learned not to expect. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll make coffee." They talked for 6 hours that first day. They talked the way men do when they have an impossible amount of time to account for, and no shared language yet developed for the task, slowly at first, with long pauses, feeling for ground, testing weight before committing. Robert answered every question Mark asked, without deflection and without excuses, which was a quality Mark had not consciously anticipated, but recognized immediately as the thing he needed most. He did not dramatize his own suffering. He did not ask for sympathy. He described the choices he had made, and the choices that had been made for him with the same level tone, making clear that he understood the difference, but was not going to use it as a shield. Mark asked about the years in Northern California, the jobs, the solitude. Whether he had ever come close to giving up on finding a way back. Robert described a life lived on the margins of the one he had wanted: decent work, a few good friendships, a community he had been part of without being fully of. He had not remarried. He had come close once, in his early 50s, but found that he could not fully give himself to something new, while so much of him was still living in the past. Mark recognized this immediately and did not comment on it. What Mark had not been prepared for was the conversation that came in the late afternoon, when the winter light was getting low and golden over the harbor, and they had moved from coffee to something stronger, sitting by the window with the water visible between the cypress branches. Robert said there was something Mark needed to know about his mother. He said it carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who had been deciding for years how and whether to say it, and had ultimately concluded that the truth, however painful, was a form of respect. Linda Jensen, in the last 2 years of her life, had discovered the full truth of what had happened, not from Robert himself, but from her brother Gary, who had developed a late-life illness of his own and had, in what Robert described without bitterness as a guilt-ridden and ultimately self-serving confession, told his sister what he had done. Gary had told her about the false accusations. He had told her about the intercepted letters. He had told her about the arrangement made with the lawyer. He had told her, in other words, that the story she had believed for 20 years was not the story. Linda had called Robert within a week of learning this. It was the call Evelyn had mentioned. Robert confirmed what Evelyn had said, that Linda had wept, that she had apologized, that she had said she would tell Mark. She had said she needed a little time to find the right way to do it. She had been dealing with a recurrence of her illness at the time, and she was managing her energy carefully. And she had asked Robert for a few more weeks. She had not had a few more weeks. Her illness had moved faster than either of them expected in that final stretch. And she had died without having the conversation with Mark that she had promised herself she would have. But she had written a letter. Robert stood and went to a small desk in the corner of the room and opened a drawer and came back with an envelope that Mark recognized immediately, the same ivory paper, the same weight, except that this one was in his mother's handwriting. His name was on the front. It was sealed. "She sent this to me," Robert said, sitting back down, "with a note asking me to give it to you if she didn't get the chance herself. I've had it for 7 years. Mark took the envelope. His hands were steadier than he would have expected. He opened it. His mother's letter was 2 pages, in the familiar handwriting he associated with grocery lists and birthday cards. and the notes she used to leave on the kitchen counter when she went out in the evenings. It was the handwriting of someone writing under the pressure of limited time, which gave it a spare, undecorated quality that was, in its own way, more devastating than any eloquence would have been. She wrote that she had been wrong. Not wrong in every individual judgment. She had been a young woman in a difficult marriage, trying to protect herself and her son from what she had genuinely believed to be a man who had chosen to abandon them, but wrong in her ultimate understanding of what had happened, wrong in the story she had allowed to solidify into fact, wrong in not questioning her family's version with more rigor when Mark was old enough to have been allowed a different truth. She wrote that she had not known about the intercepted letters until Gary told her. She wrote that she understood if Mark found that hard to believe, given everything. And she wrote that she was not asking him to give her credit for ignorance. She was asking him only to know that she had never intentionally deprived him of his father. She wrote about the phone call with Robert. She described his voice unchanged after so many years, still careful and quiet, and said that speaking to him had made her understand something about herself she had avoided for a long time, that she had loved him, and that the grief of losing the marriage had made it easier to accept the story that cast him as the villain, because the alternative that something tragic had happened to a family that might otherwise have been intact was too painful to hold. She had not manufactured the story. She had inherited it and then leaned on it because the truth was heavier. And then, near the end of the letter, she wrote something that made Mark set the pages down on his knee and look out at the water for a long time. She wrote, "I hope you find him. I hope you give him the chance I should have given him years ago. And I hope, when you do, that you find in him what I found in that one phone call, which is someone who never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." Mark sat by the window of his father's cottage and looked at the harbor turning silver in the last of the afternoon light, and he felt something shift in the architecture of himself, not a collapse but a restructuring, slow and significant, like tectonic plates finding a new and more honest alignment. He was thinking about all the years he had spent in Millfield, eating soup from a can at a kitchen table, designed for more people than him, building a life that fit precisely around the absence at its center. And he was thinking about his father living alone on this stretch of coast, walking the beach in the early mornings and cutting out newspaper articles from a county he had never lived in, and he was thinking about his mother in her last years, carrying the weight of a confession she never got to deliver, and he understood something that he had not had the language for before now. No one in this story had been entirely right. No one had been entirely wrong. Everyone had been doing the most damaged version of their best, and the consequences had been passed, like a debt, through every relationship and every year and every silent evening until they had arrived, improbably and overdue, at a rainy night knock on a door in Millfield, Oregon. The months that followed were not easy, but they were honest, which turned out to be more valuable. Mark drove down to Harrow Cove most weekends through the winter, and Robert drove up to Millfield twice in the spring, and they spent their time together the way people do when they are building something from very old materials carefully, without forcing the joints, accepting the gaps where the pieces do not fit perfectly, and learning to work around them. There were conversations that were harder than either of them anticipated, and silences that were more comfortable than either of them had a right to expect. There were moments when the accumulated weight of 33 lost years pressed down on everything, and made ordinary sentences feel very heavy. There were other moments over coffee, over a walk along the harbor, over the kind of stupid argument about the correct way to make scrambled eggs that only happens between people who feel safe enough to argue, when something that was recognizably warmth moved between them, uncertain and new and real. Mark drove back to his father's once with the wooden box in the back seat, and they sat together at Robert's kitchen table and went through the contents the way historians go through primary sources, methodically, without sentimentality, trying to establish what had actually happened and when. Robert identified letters he remembered writing. Mark identified postmarks that matched dates his mother had told him, years ago, were periods of particular stress. They laid the pieces out and looked at them, and gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the actual shape of the past became visible beneath the shape they had each been given. The wooden box, when Mark finally brought it back to Millfield, was no longer kept in the back of anything. He put it on a shelf in the living room, between a stack of history books and a lamp with a warm bulb, that he sometimes left on in the evenings when he wanted the room to feel less empty. He was not sure when he had started thinking of it as something other than a container for pain, but at some point it had become something else, an object that stood for the idea that truth was retrievable, even from very deep hiding, and that finding it was worth the effort of looking. He started opening the front door without hesitation. That sounds like a small thing, but for a man who had spent years hearing a knock and feeling the faint wash of dread that comes from living a life braced for loss, it was not a small thing. He answered the door when the mail carrier rang. He answered the door for neighbors. He answered the door for a colleague from work who stopped by, unannounced one evening, and seemed briefly surprised by the warmth of the welcome. He called Evelyn Carter every week or two, and they talked in the easy way of people who have done something important together and know that they are bound by it. He thanked her once, formally, and she told him to stop and said that carrying those letters for 22 years had been its own kind of burden, and that she was lighter for having set it down. He believed her. In the spring, Robert's health deteriorated somewhat. Nothing catastrophic, but the accumulation of age and years of solitary living taking their quiet toll, and Mark drove down for 3 consecutive weekends and helped him reorganize the cottage, make some improvements to the kitchen, and locate a doctor in the nearest town who was worth trusting. They argued about the right way to stack firewood. They watched an Oregon State game together on a small television, and Robert turned out to have opinions about college football that were surprisingly heated and entirely uninformed, which Mark found, to his own surprise, genuinely funny. One evening, in late May, sitting on the dock behind the cottage watching the light die on the water, Robert said, without looking at him, "I know this isn't what it would have been." A pause. "I know we're building something on a foundation that isn't what it should be." Another pause. "But I want you to know that I'm grateful for every bit of it." Mark looked at the harbor for a while. A pelican was making its low, prehistoric arc across the surface of the water. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, and the particular coolness that comes off the Pacific in the evenings, no matter what the season. "So am I," he said. And he meant it in a way that had no asterisks. One afternoon in early summer, Mark was at his kitchen table in Millfield when a knock came at the front door. He stood up without hesitation. He crossed the hallway. He put his hand on the knob. Afternoon light was coming in through the window beside the door, in the way it did in early June, warm and at a low angle, turning the dust in the air golden. He could see a shape through the frosted glass, a neighbor, probably, or the woman from the end of the street who sometimes brought surplus vegetables from her garden. He opened the door and smiled at whoever was there. This was not the same man who had stood in this doorway on a rainy night in October, braced for confusion or disappointment, or more silence. That man had been constructed very carefully around a wound he had never been allowed to properly examine. He had been functional and quiet and self-sufficient and lonely in a way that had felt, for decades, indistinguishable from peace. He had believed that some answers never came, and had organized his life according to that belief. He knew better now, not in a way that erased the years, or undid the loss, or made the story clean. The story was not clean, and would never be. But in a way that allowed him to stand in his own doorway in the summer light, without the old familiar weight behind his sternum, without the closed-door feeling that had shadowed everything for so long. What he had learned, through a rainy night, and a wooden box, and dozens of letters, and 2 long drives down a coastal highway, and 1 conversation at a harbor dock in the last light of a winter afternoon, was something he suspected he had always almost known, but had never been given the evidence to fully believe. That the people who disappear from our lives are not always gone by choice. That the silences we inherit are not always the silences that were intended for us. That families carry damage the way rivers carry sediment invisibly, in suspension, depositing it somewhere downstream where someone who had no part in the original erosion finds it silting up their floor. And he had learned something else, something quieter and more personal. He had learned that forgiveness, the real kind, not the kind that is proclaimed and then quietly withheld, but the kind that actually reorganizes the way you carry the past, is not a decision made once. It is a practice. It is the daily choice to set down the version of the story that makes you the only victim and pick up instead the more complicated and more true version, in which everyone is partially broken and partially doing their best, and partially responsible for the damage that radiates outward from their choices. His mother had loved him. His father had never stopped loving him. He had spent 33 years believing himself abandoned, when the truth was that he had been surrounded by imperfect love that was simply unable, for reasons of fear and shame and family politics and the ordinary machinery of human failure, to reach him. That love had always been there. It had been in a wooden box on a stranger's shelf in Sacramento. It had been in a notebook left with a landlady in a coastal town. It had been in a sealed envelope written by a dying woman who ran out of time. He had found it, finally, at the age of 42, on a night when he had almost decided not to answer the door. The afternoon light was warm on his face. He stood in the open doorway and breathed the early summer air and thought about his father, walking the beach at Harrow Cove in the morning while the harbor woke up around him. He would drive down on Saturday. They had not made any particular plan, which was the whole point, simply showing up, simply being present in the same place at the same time, building the ordinary fabric of a relationship that had been 30 years in the making and deserved, at last, the chance to become something unremarkable and durable and real. Forgiveness does not rewrite what happened. It cannot give back the years, or restore the mornings and the milestones and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that were taken from two people by a combination of cowardice and grief and the small, compounding cruelties that families sometimes visit on themselves. But it does something else, something that is in some ways more useful. It opens the door. Not the front door, though, that too, but the interior door, the one that a person closes, over the long years of a wound, against the possibility that anything good or true or healing can still come through. Mark Jensen had kept that door closed for a very long time. He had opened it on a rainy October night, not knowing what he was letting in. What came through changed everything, and standing in the summer light on the other side of all of it, what he felt underneath the grief for the years that could not be recovered, underneath the complicated tenderness for a mother who had done her flawed and loving best, underneath the slow and careful work of building something new with a man, he was only now beginning to know what he felt was something that had been absent for so long, he had almost forgotten what to call it. He felt, at last, like someone whose story was not yet finished, and he was glad.